giving some folks a little time to join. So can you tell us what you've been doing with Compute Engine so far?
Well, it came in handy a couple of weeks ago or late last month. I was running some MongoDB processes on my local workstation in my office, and I was going to be traveling for a couple of weeks, and so I needed to be able to access that big processing and do it while being mobile. So I moved that process to Compute Engine, so I could bring it up on my laptop when I was traveling and do some heavy duty computing that I wouldn't be able to run on my laptop.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really where I knuckled down and started to learn it.
Any speed bumps along the way?
Not really. I've had a few questions come up this past week. I've been starting to use it for clusters, setting up a Hadoop cluster, so I could just with one script and hit a command on my keyboard, run a shell script that would launch 8 nodes and configure all of them and launch the processes in a few minutes. And that's nice using the combination of the metadata system to configure each specific nodes on some things, like the master nodes.
Yeah, we should probably consolidate those and produce a best practice shell script for that kind of thing, because I think that shell script's been written many times. I've written that myself, and it's a great training exercise. But I also think it would be cool to have a really good version that had kind of a composite of all the best functionality and best style and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I snuck in right before Google I/O was the ability in GCUtil to provide multiple arguments to add instance, so you can actually add multiple instances there. So if you want to bring up, 5 instances with one command to GCUtil, you can do that. I don't think we've documented that well. It's kind of a little.
No, I haven't seen that. My shell script just does it one at a time.
Yeah, that'd be cool. So we have 10 or so people live streaming the event and not seeing any additional folks join. Why don't we get started? We're about 5 minutes past the official start time. So I will share a screen here. Oh, just got Benjamin joining us. Welcome, Benjamin.
Thank you. Hello.
So we're just about to get started. Going to share a screen here. You guys seeing my slide?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the agenda for this, well, I'd like to keep this pretty informal. The agenda is basically a short kind of tech talk, and the topic for today that I chose was to talk a little bit about authentication and service accounts, and then we'll leave the remainder of the time for question and answer. And we have a moderator queue with a few questions we've already gotten, but we'll combine the live questions and the recorded questions. It's a small enough group that if anybody wants to jump in at any time, just yell and stop me with a question. So I wanted to talk about service accounts today because I think Compute Engine's done some really interesting work in that space. Somebody's joining, so let me pause for a second. Ryan, welcome.
Hi.
Hi. So we're just talking about service accounts, and in order to kind of say what I want to say about service accounts, I need to talk a little bit about OAuth, because service accounts are kind of built on top of the OAuth mechanism. And so just wanted to explain a little bit about OAuth 2. I'm going to do something which is probably reckless. I'm going to try to explain OAuth 2 in like 2 or 3 slides, and people do this can spend hours on this subject. So anyway, the basic idea, before I kind of explain what it is, I wanted to just discuss some terminology really quickly. So authentication versus authorization, what's the difference? Authentication is assessing who you are, or validating that you are who you assert you are. Whereas authorization is more, okay, now that we know, or we at least have a strong probability that you are who you say you are, what can you do? What sorts of resources are you allowed to have access to, and how? What method, what modes of access? And so the primary focus of OAuth is authorization, and so that's what I'll kind of focus on, although there has been some recent work in the OAuth area to include authentication as well. And there was a really good talk given at Google I/O by Ryan Boyd this year, which you can, I think I have a link to it at the end of these slides, which talk about both sides of the coin, how OAuth is pulling in authentication as well as authorization. OAuth is an open standard for delegating access to resources. So it's a way that it's not just a Google thing, it's an industry-wide thing. And but it is used extensively by many of the Google APIs. The last official count I saw was over 35. I think it's a bigger number than that. That's the number of Google APIs that are using OAuth for authorization. And there are many more external APIs using it as well. Let's see. The model behind OAuth is a delegation model, meaning that there are these entities, clients, servers, and resource owners. So you're a resource owner if you own something that's served up by a server. And in the OAuth model, the client is kind of the intermediary, and I'll have a diagram that I think will illustrate this a little bit better. But the idea is that you authenticate yourself to the server, and then the server interacts with the resource owner, or sorry, you authenticate yourself to the client, and the client interacts with the server on your behalf, and you essentially delegate access to your resources. So the key idea here is if you go to a website and it wants to get access to your resources, without OAuth 2, the probably most natural way to do that would be to ask you for your password. Like, let's imagine an app that wants to do something with your calendar entries. The natural way might be to ask you for your calendar login and password. That's bad for many reasons. It's bad for you, and it's bad for the app. The app, application developers don't want to be in the business of storing passwords in databases. So the idea behind OAuth 2 is it's a way for you to tell the application, I'm willing to give you access to my calendar resources, and only my calendar resources. And you don't have to provide any password, and it all just kind of works correctly, and it's safe and secure, and so on. So it's really a delegation mechanism at root. The valet key is the prototypical way people like to describe OAuth, because when you leave your car with a valet, you can give him or her a separate key, and it limits what access they have, what things they have access to. So apps register as OAuth clients via the Google Developers Console, and I'll show you that in a little bit, what that looks like. So if you're creating an app, you'll go to the Developer Console, and you'll step through some pages that let you define aspects of your application and get sort of credentials like the client ID and the client secret that let you kind of get started using the OAuth flows. And one of the things you'll have to say is what type of application it is. So there are multiple scenarios. You can create a web server model. That's probably the most common and widely used one, but you can also create a web client. That's where you're kind of building a JavaScript application that wants to directly do OAuth authorization without having to go through a server intermediary. Of course, mobile apps are very popular. You can do command line access, and we also have something called service accounts, which we'll talk about a little bit more shortly. This is what we affectionately refer to as the OAuth dance, and so hopefully everybody has lived this experience, but this kind of tries to schematically summarize what's going on when you're actually using OAuth. So you're the happy resource owner, and you're happy because you don't have to tell anybody your password. You're interacting with a web server, which at the same time is an OAuth client. And through the details of the protocol, and I don't have time to go through like step by step the different legs of the protocol, but through the interactions between the web server and the OAuth server, you effectively access you are redirected to a dialogue, and there's a screenshot of the dialogue right here, where it basically asks you explicitly whether you want to allow the permission that the application is requesting. And you can either allow or deny. And if you allow, the flow is redirected back to your web server with some information that the web server can extract from the redirect path. And it can use the OAuth protocol to turn that data into time-limited access tokens. So the access tokens are kind of like the final ticket to actually get access to the resources. And they're both time limited and scope limited. So you can specify a scope, which is manifested in this dialogue by the fact that it's asking to manage your calendars and your documents. Scope in OAuth can be both operational, like manage versus read-only, and it can be application-oriented as well, or data-oriented as well, like calendars versus documents. So it can be both scope limited and time limited. The time limitation comes in the fact that access tokens typically live for on the order of an hour. And there's a mechanism where applications can refresh those tokens, the access tokens, either interactively with you while you're involved in the transaction or in an offline mode when you're not even around. And that's a function of how the whole dialogue or how the whole transaction is done. So hopefully you've seen that before. It makes sense. But there's some problems with this model when you start to try to do things in more of a server or a service-to-service oriented fashion. So specifically, imagine that you're using Google Compute Engine and you have 1,000 virtual machines. And now you have to actually iterate over those machines to do something to affect this OAuth dance 1,000 times. You're really not going to want to do that. One of the important innovations in Google Compute Engine is that when you create a virtual machine, you get an identity associated with your project, and that identity is set up in such a way that the OAuth dance, quote unquote, can be done for you automatically. So you don't have to go visit 1,000 machines and do that click-through business 1,000 times. The other thing that's important is your application is not you. And so with traditional uses of OAuth, you would register your account, your personal account, or maybe some account associated with your business, to this application you're working on that's kind of moderating all this delegation of authority. And the scope of that account may not be perfectly overlapping with the scope of the data that the application wants to manage. So it really makes sense in this world to have an account that embodies the application and is limited, scope limited to the data that the application operates on. And that's what you get with service account. That's kind of one of the main ideas behind service accounts. So really, what you want is an application with an identity of its own and the ability to automatically authenticate programmatically with that identity without having a human being present to be clicking on interactive dialogues. And that's what service accounts give you. So you get first of all, a service account is just a Gmail account. It's a Google account like any other Google account, except that it's typically associated with a project or an application rather than a human being. And the two key benefits you get from using these service accounts are what I've just mentioned, which are that it's automatic. There's no need to do the OAuth dance. And I guess I didn't mention the second point, which is that it gives you transparent access with Google Compute Engine because we've done things to make that so. So service accounts are kind of built right in, baked right into Google Compute Engine and quite nicely integrated with your VMs. And I'll show a quick demo of that shortly. A couple other points are that the service account is created when you create your Compute Engine project. So it comes into existence automatically. and it has access by default to your project data. Users on your project team can act as this account, and you can also have finer grained control, like you can use ACLs to limit access to sub-resources independently of your service account. And service accounts have a broader applicability than just Compute Engine. They can be used in other Google APIs, and they can be used even outside of APIs using JSON Web Tokens. There's a whole larger kind of area that you can learn about regarding service accounts in general, but really the focus for today is service accounts inside Compute Engine. Any questions? I've been talking for a while. Any questions up till now? For people who are not attending live, who are streaming this, feel free to, the original invitation has a moderator page where you can add your questions, so feel free to add your thoughts or comments or feedback there. Okay, so back to the slides. How do service accounts work inside Google Compute Engine? So it's built right in. When, like I mentioned earlier, it gets auto-created. The account itself gets auto-created with your project. The virtual machine instances are automatically told about your service account and kind of wired up to use your service account when you create the instance with a special option called -- service account scopes. And that's really kind of doing two things. One, it's telling it to use the service account, and it's also giving it the specific scope to assign to the tokens that it obtains for that service account. And the example here shows a shorthand. An earlier version, we used full URLs, but the latest version of GCUtil supports these shorter names. So this is giving read-write access for Compute Engine and read-write access for Google Cloud Storage. And when you create the VM like this, the GCUtil and GSUtil commands just work. We call that frictionless because, as I'll show in a second, the software internally knows how to obtain the access tokens for the service account and then be able to do everything it needs to do without having to do any OAuth dance. It's also easy to use with other Google APIs. There are ways that you can programmatically access the service accounts access tokens through our metadata server. So even if you don't have a command like GCUtil or GSUtil that kind of is wired right up to do the right thing here, there are ways that if you're building a service that wants to use some other Google API, for example, it can do the same technique and get access very easily to access tokens through the metadata server. So let's switch gears here and do some live stuff. What I'm showing here is the developer console, and this is a project I just created, and it doesn't yet have any clients, any OAuth 2 clients. So there's an overview page where you can see various things about the project, but when you do want to do something with OAuth, you go to the API access page and you create an OAuth client. You give it a name. You can give it a logo if you want. You can tell something about what type of application, so this gets into that whole business about all those different flows and so on. And then you create the client ID, and then you get some information back which give you credentials for that client. And then those are useful for actually transacting the different flows.
Mark, can you go back one page for a second, please?
Sure.
So, okay, I see what I'm looking for. Thank you.
Okay. So that's not really related to service accounts, but I just wanted to share that with you so you know what that looks like if you're trying to do something with OAuth in general. To talk a little bit more about service accounts, I'm going to switch the screen share from my browser to a shell window. Is everybody seeing my shell window?
Yeah.
And are you seeing the screen fully? Seeing the bottom of the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm on my laptop here, and I'm going to do GSUtil, and I'm going to basically create an instance with a service account. I have a environment variable that I have set with the scope that I want, and as you can see, I'm giving 2 scopes to the OAuth requirement. So I'll say gcutil add instance. We'll call this foo, and I'll give it the service account scope equals $scoped.
I have a question.
Yep.
The compute read write. What does that allow? I know the storage full for reading and writing from the Google storage, but
Right. So storage full actually gives me reading, writing, and like almost everything. Like I can modify ACLs and stuff like that. Compute read write means that I have pretty much read and write ability. I can create instances. I can delete things. I guess read, I'm kind of educated guessing. I should defer to Joe on this, but I'm kind of assuming that read means I can access stuff without changing it, but Joe can give a better answer.
Okay,
Yeah, I mean, so pretty much there's only 2 scopes for compute engine, read only and read write. And so, they do what you think. If you're going to impact or mutate anything, you need the read write scope. We're going to be looking at, providing more fine-grained controls and policies, trying right now to figure out the right way to do that.
Okay, so this is if you want one instance to be able to control other instances.
Exactly. So if you were going to have an instance that was going to implement, say, an auto-scaling algorithm to spin up and spin down instances, as appropriate, then that scope would be the one to go.
Okay.
Right. And I think it's more than like an instance. I think it's like I want the service account that's created to have this access, so that any VM I create or anything I do within VMs that are associated with that service account will have that.
No,
ability.
it's on a instance by instance basis. So you can have one instance using a service account and whitelist a certain set of scopes, and you can have another instance using that same service account and whitelisting a different set of scopes.
Okay, I guess that raises another question, but I'll get to that when I log into the machine. So I just did a get instance, gcutil get instance on the newly created instance, and it's got status running, which is great. That means it should be available. So I'll use gcutil ssh foo, and I'm kind of glossing over the fact that gcutil is doing some nice things for me in the space of SSH public-private key management, where it's pushing the right keys, public key in the right place on the created VM, so that I didn't have to use a password. And it's not because that's wide open; it's because SSH did the right thing cryptographically, and the gcutil SSH command did all the right arguments on SSH to make sure that it specified the right keys and so on. So here I am logged into my foo, my new VM. And because of the fact that I gave it that scope, I now have full access to gcutil and gsutil. So I can say gsutil mb make a bucket gs:/mark dash new. No surprise, that already exists. So really new. And there it is, and I can do things like echo hello, typed into gsutil copy -2 gs, and it'll put stuff up. So I'm basically using Google Cloud Storage, using the service account without having to have done anything magical to set it up. And if I, again, created 1,000 VMs, they would all be gsutil ready. Google Cloud Storage ready, so it's not just gsutil. I can use APIs and things as well, and things just kind of work naturally the way you'd like them to, which I think is really nice. And it also shows good integration. It makes it really easy to use Google Cloud Storage from VM and so on. I can also use gcutil in the same way. I can say gcutil add instance bar. And now I'm in a VM creating another VM, and I have full access to, probably not, I shouldn't have done that. I should have been a good, I have my security friend sitting here next to me who probably just frowned at me for not entering a passphrase. in the instance of not like mistyping it, I skipped.
Busily hacking it.
He's hacking into my system as we speak. So if you do what I just did, please set up a passphrase. Don't do as I say, not as I do. Anyway, I'm able to use GCUtil to create images, or instances rather, from a VM just as easily. I didn't have to do a configuration step because of the joys of service accounts. And the question I was going to ask you earlier, Joe, was when I'm in a VM that was created with a service account scope, and then I create another VM, does it sort of inherit that scope, or do I need to specify -- service account scope again to make sure that propagates?
You've asked a very, very good question. So every time you start an instance, you have to specify which scopes and which service accounts you want to make available to that particular instance. And currently we don't pass through any of those scopes, and so if you give a VM access to the compute scope, it can launch other instances with expanded scope, and so something to be aware of.
Okay. So that's almost taken us to halfway through the session, and that pretty much covers what I wanted to show you interactively. Let me undo the... Actually, yeah, let me switch the screen share back to the slides because there's one more slide I wanted to show. So back to this. There's a resources slide I just wanted to share with you, and this has like pretty much everything I could find that I thought would be really helpful in the space of OAuth, the developers console link, and specifically service accounts. One thing I didn't include was a link to that YouTube video, but I'd strongly, if you're interested in a great kind of overview of all things OAuth and a little bit on service accounts as well, and also how OAuth is working its way into the authentication space, try Googling Google I/O 2012 OAuth, and you'll find a really good talk by Ryan Boyd, as I mentioned earlier. This OAuth 2.0 playground is worth visiting as well if you're interested in this stuff. It's a really cool site, interactive site that lets you construct queries or interactively transact OAuth requests. So you'd say, this is the scope I'm interested in, and then you can authorize the API, and it kind of actually takes you through the dialogue like that, and then you can say exchange that for a refresh token. It really sort of, and now I have an access and a refresh token, and I can refresh it and so on. So, and I get the requests and the response over in the right tab. So really nice site for kind of seeing how this all works and getting a better sense of OAuth. And you can also try debugging things if you're having trouble getting something to work. I think that's it for my slides, and the next section I wanted to move to was Q&A. We're open-ended here, so anything you want to talk about in Compute Engine is fair game. Don't necessarily limit to OAuth or service accounts. And we're also really interested in your feedback based on actual experience you've had with the product so far. So it's not just questions, but also any comments we'd love to hear. So I'm going to switch off my screen share, and I'll open the floor now. Don't all rush at once.
So based on the discussion this morning on the mailing list, can you talk a little bit about V6?
Let me just expound on that a little bit. You know, it's a matter of Google continuing to build out its V6 infrastructure and us building the support into the product. And so, you know, we can't give timelines on stuff like this just because we don't want to make promises that we're not 100% sure we can keep. And you know, software development is a messy business. But it's definitely, you know, I know there is disappointment within the company that we're not V6 enabled already. So, you know, if you're disappointed outside of Google, there's disappointment inside of Google also, and so it's something that you know, people's hearts are behind it, and we're going to work to get there.
Okay, thanks, guys. I'm going to jump to the moderator. We have the top-rated question so far is what other versions of operating systems, SUSE, Red Hat, Windows, etc., are in the pipeline? And that may be also in that similar category of we're not allowed to say much about what we're planning to do.
Well, I can say one thing is that as long as it's Linux and you're happy with the kernel that we have, you can run any user mode that you like. It's rolling your own user mode is kind of an advanced scenario, but you can upload a raw disk file, make it 10 gigabytes with one partition, and we'll boot the kernel and point it at that file system. Beyond Linux, it gets a little bit trickier, and we can't we don't have anything to really talk about right now about that.
Yeah, one thing we can say though is if you have a specific need for an operating system that we're not supporting, we'd love to hear from you. So send mail to gcteam@google.com or the discussion group and let us know what your needs are, and that helps us calibrate what sort of things we should be trying to support down the road. How about a live question? Anybody in the Hangout have another question?
Yeah, just a quick question. The service accounts, when I launch Compute Engine instances, I specify the storage account scope, but I don't specify a service account. Am I doing something wrong there? I remember setting up one service account earlier on, but I haven't really paid attention to it since then.
There's a little bit of confusion here. I think currently there's two types of service accounts. There's service accounts that can be used outside of Compute Engine using the JWT flow, and you get a certificate for those guys, and you'll see those listed in the API console.
Okay.
There's also currently one, but we've built the APIs with room for expanding it. There's one service account available to within the Compute Engine world, and because there's only one right now, we default to that. It's called default, so it's kind of default all around. But and so we're going to be looking to be able to have multiple service accounts at some point, hopefully, and you can specify how what permissions each of those service accounts have, and scope those things down.
Thanks, Joe. Let's see. When adding persistent disk to instance, if it's already mounted, it will not mount read-only as the documentation appears to state. ---- disk equals disk ID, comma mode equals read-only generates resource in use error.
So a disk can be mounted read-only across multiple instances, or read-write to only one instance. And so, without looking at the specific case here, my guess is that it's mounted read-write to one instance, and you're trying to mount it read-only to a different instance. And so, we don't support hot plug of persistent disks yet. And so, what you'll have to do is shut down the instance that has the disk mounted read-write, and then you can bring up a plethora of instances that mount the disk read-only.
Okay. Live question.
What are the plans for DNS services?
For DNS, yeah, there are a whole host of sort of supporting services that we want to build. DNS is definitely on our radar. It's again, it's I wish I could give more detail in terms of the when, but we think that it's definitely should be part of the offering. I think one of the things that I think people like about App Engine, for example, is that based on your app ID, you actually get a bunch of automatic names, and so there's sort of automatic registration of external DNS. And so as we look towards doing DNS stuff, no promises, but that's the type of thing that inspires us in terms of making some of this stuff easy by default, but then letting you do more advanced things also.
So rather than sort of guess at what all of the different pieces might be and have you say that you can't talk about when. Can you tell us what sorts of things are coming up in, say, the next 12 months without giving any kind of dates? Like, that DNS is interesting, CDN is interesting, V6 is interesting, non-Linux VM is interesting, right? So all this stuff, you're going to give the same answer. So let's just talk about what's actually on the list.
Well, the one thing that we have talked about, specifically, and we talked about at I/O, and I saw that there was another question on the question page. I don't have that link handy though. Was we are working actively on disk snapshots. We think that that's a really important part of the platform, and so that's something that we're really looking at. Beyond that, you're putting me in a tough position here, dude. it's tough to, I mean, one of the things is that Google's investing heavily in the cloud platform as a whole, and so there's a lot of stuff starting up, and we're putting a lot of effort into this stuff. Predicting the timelines of how this stuff is going to come together is really, really difficult, and it's a matter of sort of how fast can we grow and sustainably grow our footprint. So there's a certain amount of integrating under the curve in terms of growth and how much work we can get done. That's really difficult to predict, and especially
I'm going to give you a hard time. I'm a big fan of VCE, and I understand that there are all sorts of variables that go into this, but I'm looking at this as not a marketing sort of call, right? We've got people on here who build things, and I'm not trying to get anyone to commit to any sort of timeline at all. You can leave dates out entirely. I'm interested in what the list of things that you guys think are most important to get done, regardless of dates. What are the most important things to you?
Let me circle around with our product managements and see if we can put together. Well, no, I think it's a good point. It's a good point. I can't, I think I would probably catch some flack if I listed sort of, the list of things that we're working on right now, just because some of those are going to bear fruit and there's going to be some change of directions and stuff like that. But I would love to be able to share some of those details externally. And so let me get together with the product management team and see what we can do in terms of getting together, not a timeline, but like at least a sort of a rough sketch of where we're taking things.
Yeah,
I'm interested in your priorities. What matters most to you?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I'm getting an IM suggestion that we should talk about the space laser integration.
Actually, I wanted to interject something, and this may seem like I'm doing sleight of hand, but I actually feel very sincere about this. What we do and what we prioritize is a function of what our customers ask for. And so I'm going to turn your question around on you, Benjamin, and I'm going to ask you, what are the 3 or 5 or however many you want to name most important things you think we should be focusing on over the next 6 to 12 months for your needs?
And that's where essentially the list that I'm asking is the list that is most important to me. So it's DNS, it's CDN, it's much more sophisticated networking. The networking underneath what you're providing is far more interesting than what's getting exposed.
Can you say more about that? Like when you say the more sophisticated networking, what do you mean?
I mean a variety of things. I don't want to have to, I want to be able to define multiple different subnets and policies for moving between them and then just put things in them and not worry about, say, access lists, which are very crude. I want to be able to connect my own infrastructure with yours over that without having a lot of constraints on what that means, right?
Like an enterprise VPN type configuration?
Right.
Exactly.
And I'm very interested in both Windows and Solaris VMs. In many ways more than Linux, but at least as much as Linux.
Mm-hmm. How about other people on the call? Ryan or John, Yuri, what would you guys say would be the 3 most important things you think we could add to the product in the near term? Putting you on the spot.
Yeah.
Let me throw out one more before they start, which is monitoring. Your internal infrastructure for monitoring is unbelievable, and I think a lot of people would benefit from at least the thinking, if not the tools themselves.
So, our internal infrastructure for monitoring, is awesome. It's also probably one of the most difficult things to actually configure and use at Google internally. I don't think I'm giving too much away by talking about that. And so, finding a way to make the easy things easy and the hard things possible, applies doubly, I think, on the monitoring side of things. So that's something that I've been thinking about. I can't make any promises, but it's definitely something that we've been thinking about and talking about.
Other input from anybody?
It's not really top on my list, but having other Windows servers instances available could be beneficial. I don't prefer to use them, but there's some cases that
Where you need them.
nice to fire them up.
Okay. Does anybody have any experience with frustrations? Not something that we haven't implemented per se, but something that we have implemented and you either think it's wrong, it's not working the way you want, or it's hard to understand how to use it. Anything along those lines? Pain points.
The limit of 16 drives per instance is somewhat hurting.
16 drive per instance limitation.
Yes.
How many would you like? I know unlimited is a great answer, but
Quadruple them, 64.
okay.
Hey, let me talk about the disk stuff real quick. So one of the things that we definitely want to be adding and we know is missing in the product. There's a lot of places where things that should be dynamic aren't dynamic, and those are some of the rough edges that we're going to be working hard to fix. So an example is mounting and unmounting disks dynamically, sort of hot plug of disks. And as part of that, we're planning on switching the disk implementation, the driver model, for the virtual machine from VirtIO Block to VirtIO SCSI. And that lets us utilize a whole bunch of the hot plug infrastructure that's built into the Linux kernel and everything else to actually be able to sort of, remove lock devices dynamically. And so, it takes a while to sort of, build some of that stuff out. And I believe that I think that might be one of the other things that's preventing us from mounting more than 16 disks. It's good to know that you wanted to. It's a good feature request to be able to mount more than the 16. We're also working to make the hard limit on the amount of persistent disk that you can attach be more of a soft limit. There's a certain amount of memory overhead associated with our disk implementation that caps the amount that you can mount, and so that's why that limit is there. And making it so that if your hot section of the disk is within a certain size, you'll see the best performance, but things actually sort of scale well past that is another thing that we know we need to be attacking. So there's a couple of sort of more near-term concrete things, not big features, not sort of big extra services, but sort of rough edges that we know we have to start keep working on.
Any other pain points? Time. Your opportunity.
I have a question. For doing something like parallel SSHing, if I wanted to send a command to a whole bunch of instances, is there a way to do that with GCUtil SSH, or right now I've just iterated through them on a shell script and been it to send something to them. Is there any recommendation?
You're doing a command rather than an interactive login. You could throw your suppose you could throw your SSHs into the background, although I haven't actually tried that, and you might run into a limit if you do too many at the same time. I'm not aware of any built-in parallelism in GCUtil for SSHing commands. Do you know of anything in that space, Joe, or anybody else?
I think no. That's not supported in GCUtil. I think that there's a temptation to keep adding features onto GCUtil to sort of take on more and more, sort of what I call orchestration, keeping track of lots of VMs, what they're doing, and what's going on inside of them. I And one of the sort of philosophies behind Compute Engine and really Google's infrastructure as a whole is that we want to leverage what's existing out there. We don't want to be the end-all, be-all solution for everything. And so we don't want to build a poor man's version of something like Chef or Puppet or Fabric or Capistrano or like all these other systems that people have built and used and get used to, right? And so I think that we'd be much more interested in getting the core libraries out there and across a bunch of languages so that these systems can be built to integrate with Compute Engine. And then instead of using GCUtil, we say, hey, go use this other great thing that's actually out there in the open source world and has a community behind it. And so, yeah, I think it's like I could probably name like 30 different features that I would add to GCUtil, and this would be one of them. But we're trying to be careful not to take on too much there and sort of confuse the space and find the right sort of way to slip the clutch into something that's really more featureful than anything that like a simple command line utility would be. As part of that, though, we are working very, very hard in improving the quality and ease of use of the libraries. And so a bunch of that work you can see early on with GCElib, which was an engineer here in Seattle working to build a much better Python library for interacting with the Compute Engine API. And we're taking a lot of those ideas in terms of what he did to make that thing be a lot more usable than the sort of lowest common denominator APIs that API libraries that we have, and sort of extend those ideas both across languages and across other APIs of Google. And so that hopefully will enable not necessarily GCUtil to do stuff like parallel SSH, but enable other tools in the community to start driving GCUtil directly.
Okay.
Thanks, Joe. Just looking to see if we have any other questions on the moderator. Someone asked, are different MySQL engines actually supported? Which ones? And my answer to that would be you have a completely open-ended virtual machine and you're free to install and run any database management system you like that runs under that's supported for that particular operating system.
I think this person might be asking about Cloud SQL.
Yeah, I was wondering that too, because for some reason there are a couple Cloud SQL questions. Is a free tier for Cloud SQL?
A Cloud SQL Hangout on Monday, and I'm wondering if that isn't carryover from that. And those topics might have been covered in that Hangout, which should be posted online. In case the question askers are watching this broadcast.
Okay, so that's probably a question for a different session. Just scanning these, I think we've covered most of them. There's a Google Drive question. And let's see, there is one more here that's relevant, but I think it's in the same category that we've been talking about. It's asking when snapshots will be available. Time frame for disk snapshot functionality. It's something we've heard from other customers, and we can't say anything about specific time frame for it, but we hear the need loud and clear.
And that one's a little bit special because it's actually in our API right now. And so if you look at the API, I think you'll see some of the support for snapshots there. So you at least know the shape of what it's going to look like. And the sooner we can get that out there, the better. Obviously, that's how I feel about all these things.
Other questions? Other live? I think we've gotten through the moderator stuff. Other live questions? Going once.
I had something, but I can't remember what it was.
Other points of feedback. Things you'd like us to be doing. Things you'd like us to stop doing.
Things that you just like.
I am planning to distribute a little survey to the mailing list, so you'll have another opportunity. I know it's hard sometimes when you have to think on your feet, but we've already gotten a lot of good feedback from you guys, so really appreciate that, and we'll be sending out a survey, as I said, to give you a chance to give additional thoughts. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we'd like to kind of do this somewhat regularly. I'm not sure exactly what the interval will be, maybe every 2 weeks or something on that order. But what I think this sort of, to me at least, seems to work well, where we do a little tech topic for 20 minutes or 30 minutes at the most, and then we have a dialogue. And so if you have ideas specifically about things you'd like to know more about, or things you'd like to drill down into, please send us mail, either gcteam@google.com or gcdiscussion, or you can also hit my email address directly. It's Mark Cohen with no space or anything, markcohen@google.com. And give us your ideas, and we'll come up with some topics to cover in future Hangouts.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments that anybody wants to raise before we finish up? We have a few minutes left if you do.
Something we were talking about before the call is is to have recipes of startup scripts. Kind of a little deposit. You said, "Oh, I've done that thing a million times." As far as using the metadata and to fill in parts of your startup script.
Yeah, and that's a great idea, and I think that's an area where we can collaborate with you guys. Like, we can have a repository where we open it up to let the users, the customers, the developers, everybody involved can contribute things to make a better product for everybody. And so we do have a repository we've started internally for capturing mostly sample applications, but I think we can probably expand that. Haven't completely thought this through, but we could probably expand the scope of that to include tools and utilities that people find useful. And it's the sample repo that I'm referring to is already open source, so it's something we can share freely with the outside world. And so we'll try to do something in that space and let you guys know through the mailing list when we have something in that area.
And John, I know that you specifically mentioned Hadoop as one of the things that you were writing some scripts about. Hopefully very soon, as soon as we can get the one last sign-off, we can share the code behind the Hadoop sample that I showed at my Google I/O talk, which was written by an intern that's this week's his last week. So I was really hoping to get it out before he took off, but if not, soon afterwards, hopefully we can share that with you about. And so that'll be a more full-fledged sort of sample application of driving the API dynamically to do something like bring up a Hadoop cluster.
Great, that would be awesome.
Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you all very much for participating, and we'll try to do this again sometime soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Many, many thanks.